On November 4, 1941, Lockheed test pilot Ralph Verdon climbed into a new American fighter and took it into the clear air above Southern California. There was no enemy waiting for him. The United States had not yet entered the Second World War. No guns were firing from the ground, and no hostile aircraft were searching the sky. Verdon was flying over cities, roads, workshops, and family homes. Yet the mission was dangerous, because the airplane itself had reached a region of flight that engineers could describe only imperfectly and could not yet control with confidence. The aircraft was a P-38, an early service test version of the Lockheed Lightning. It was among the fastest and most ambitious fighters the United States had ever attempted to build. Its two engines gave it power, range, and a shape unlike any other American fighter. Its concentrated nose armament promised exceptional accuracy. Its high-altitude performance appeared to offer the Army Air Corps exactly what it had demanded, an interceptor capable of climbing rapidly and meeting an enemy far from the places that enemy intended to attack. But in a steep dive, the P-38 could enter a dangerous aerodynamic condition. As speed increased, the airflow over parts of the wing approached the speed of sound, even though the airplane as a whole remained below it. Shock waves formed. The distribution of lift and pressure changed. The nose could pitch downward, while the elevator controls became so heavy that a pilot might feel as though the control column had been locked in place. Engineers knew the general word for the problem: compressibility. What they did not yet possess was a complete practical understanding of how it affected this particular aircraft, how to reproduce it safely in available wind tunnels, or how to give a pilot reliable control after the condition began. Verdon was testing an experimental effort to improve the P-38's high-speed control. During the flight, the aircraft entered a violent maneuver and suffered structural failure. The tail separated from the twin booms. Part of the wreckage fell several streets from the main impact site. The remaining aircraft crashed into a house on Elm Street in Glendale and burst into flames. Ralph Verdon was killed. The precise chain of aerodynamic loads, control system behavior, and structural failure was more complicated than the simple legend that the airplane had struck an invisible wall. Yet his death became inseparable from the P-38's struggle with high-speed flight. The accident demonstrated that the Lightning had entered an area where ordinary assumptions about control and stability were no longer sufficient. It also showed the cost of discovering those limits through full-scale flight. Verdon's death did not end the program. War was approaching, and the United States needed the airplane. Instead, his loss became part of a long engineering effort involving Lockheed, the Army Air Forces, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, test pilots, mechanics, and combat units. The solution would not come from a single inspired trick. It would emerge through wind tunnel research, failed experiments, structural changes, revised procedures, and years of experience. The P-38 would eventually become one of the most important American fighters of the Second World War. It would serve as an interceptor, escort fighter, fighter bomber, reconnaissance aircraft, and long-range combat machine. It would fight over Europe, North Africa, the Mediterranean, China, Burma, and the Pacific. It would carry the two highest-scoring American fighter aces of the war. But before it became famous, it had to survive its own development. The story began in 1937 when the United States Army Air Corps issued a demanding requirement for a new high-altitude interceptor. The desired aircraft had to climb rapidly, reach a high maximum speed, and carry heavy armament. At the time, most American fighters were compact, single-engine machines. Their performance was limited by the power available from existing engines and by the drag created when engineers tried to add more fuel, more weapons, and more equipment. At Lockheed, designers Hall Hibbard and Clarence Kelly Johnson led the work on the new aircraft. Johnson was still young, but he had already developed a reputation for combining strong intuition with severe attention to aerodynamic detail. He understood that the Army's requirements could not easily be met by following conventional practice. A single engine might not provide enough power. A large conventional fuselage would create too much drag. The armament had to be placed where it could fire accurately without being limited by a propeller arc. Lockheed's answer was the Model 22, which became the XP-38. Two liquid-cooled Allison engines were installed in separate nacelles. Behind each engine, long boom extended rearward to support the tail. Between the booms sat a central pod containing the cockpit and the guns. The arrangement gave the Lightning its unmistakable appearance. A pilot, in a narrow central nacelle, two engines on either side, and twin booms joined by a horizontal stabilizer. The design provided several advantages. Because the guns were concentrated in the nose, they did not need to be harmonized to converge at one particular distance, as wing-mounted guns usually were. The standard wartime armament eventually became one 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns. A pilot who aimed the nose accurately could send a dense stream of fire directly into a target over a useful range of distances. The engines drove counter-rotating propellers. Their opposing rotation reduced the overall torque effects that could make a powerful single-engine fighter difficult to control. The twin engines also offered potential range and a measure of security over water or difficult terrain. If one engine failed under favorable conditions, the aircraft might still remain airborne long enough to reach a base. The design also carried risks. The P-38 was larger and heavier than the single-engine fighters with which it would later be compared. Its systems were more complicated. It required two engines, two propellers, two turbo-supercharger installations, extensive plumbing, and careful maintenance. The pilot sat alone in a cockpit, surrounded by a machine whose performance depended on many parts working together. The XP-38 first flew in January 1939. Test pilot Benjamin Kelsey quickly demonstrated that it had extraordinary speed for an American fighter of the period. On February 11, he attempted a transcontinental flight from California to New York. The journey was intended to demonstrate the aircraft's potential and to establish a rapid crossing time. The prototype crossed the continent in less than 8 hours, including stops, but the flight ended in an accident. On the final approach to Mitchell Field on Long Island, the engines lost power. Kelsey landed short of the runway, and the prototype was badly damaged. He survived. The crash could have ended a less promising project. Instead, the performance shown during the flight helped convince Army leaders that the design deserved continued support. The aircraft had demonstrated both its promise and its immaturity. It was fast enough to attract attention, but it still required extensive development before it could become a dependable weapon. Production and service test aircraft revealed further problems. Some were ordinary difficulties associated with a new design: mechanical failures, maintenance complications, cockpit discomfort, and the need to refine engine installations. Others arose because the P-38 could reach speeds and altitudes at which older assumptions began to fail. The most dangerous of these problems appeared in high-speed dives. To understand it, one must avoid the misleading idea that the entire airplane suddenly crossed the speed of sound. It did not. Instead, airflow accelerates as it moves over curved surfaces. During a fast dive, parts of the airflow over the P-38's wing could become locally supersonic, while the aircraft itself remained at a lower Mach number. Shock waves then formed and altered the pressure distribution over the wing and tail. The result could include heavy buffeting, a downward pitching tendency, often called Mach tuck, and sharply increased control forces. A pilot might pull back hard and receive little immediate response. If the aircraft continued to accelerate, the dive could steepen. Recovery might become possible only after the lightning descended into denser air, where drag increased and speed began to fall. That demanded altitude. A pilot who entered the condition too close to the ground might never have enough room to recover. This was not evidence that the P-38 was poorly conceived in every respect. It was evidence that the design had reached a region of aerodynamics that few operational aircraft had encountered so severely. The P-38 became the first airplane to expose the dangers of compressibility on a repeated and sometimes fatal operational scale. The problem was real, but required more than courage in the cockpit. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had been studying high-speed airflow before the war, and researchers such as John Stack at Langley worked to explain what was happening. Existing wind tunnels had limitations, and full-scale flight data remained essential. Investigators examined wing pressure, tail loads, elevator effectiveness, and the changing pitching moments that appeared at high Mach numbers. Early attempts to improve control did not immediately provide a safe answer. Ralph Verdon's fatal flight took place within this difficult period. He was not simply flying an ordinary aircraft carelessly. He was participating in a test program intended to define and reduce a hazard that threatened every pilot who might later take the Lightning into combat. Verdon was 43 years old. He had experience as an airmail pilot, a profession that demanded judgment, endurance, and calm in an era when navigation and weather forecasting were far less reliable than they would later become. He had a wife, Florence, and a son, Ralph Jr., who worked at Lockheed. His death was therefore not an abstract engineering loss. It struck a family and a factory community directly. The accident also warned the men responsible for the P-38 that speed could not be treated as an uncomplicated advantage. A fighter needed to dive after an enemy, escape from attack, and recover near the ground. If its controls became dangerously heavy at high Mach numbers, then its greatest performance could place it in conditions from which a pilot could not safely return. The investigation continued. Researchers eventually concluded that the fundamental problem was not cured by simply strengthening the pilot or making the elevator linkage more powerful. The airflow itself had changed the pitching characteristics of the aircraft. A successful solution had to alter those characteristics. The answer was the dive recovery flap, sometimes called a dive flap. It was not an ordinary speed brake and did not merely slow the airplane by creating drag. Installed beneath the outer wing sections on later P-38s, WWIIs, the flaps changed the pressure distribution and pitching moment of the aircraft. When deployed in the prescribed circumstances, they helped the pilot bring the nose up and begin recovery from a high-speed dive. They did not abolish compressibility. They did not permit unlimited diving without regard to speed, altitude, or procedure. A pilot still had to understand the aircraft and follow restrictions. But the flaps greatly improved the chance of recovery and represented a major practical application of high-speed aerodynamic research. The development took time. Many early P-38 units entered combat before dive recovery flaps were widely available. Pilots therefore relied on dive limits, training, and experience. Some survived compressibility encounters because the aircraft descended into denser air and slowed enough for the controls to become effective again. Others did not have sufficient altitude. The Lightning's high-altitude difficulties were not limited to compressibility. In Europe, early P-38 operations exposed problems with cockpit heating, engine reliability, fuel quality, operating procedures, and the extreme cold found on long escort missions. At high altitude, pilots could suffer numbed hands and feet. Engines and turbo supercharger systems required careful management. The aircraft's complexity punished maintenance errors and unfamiliarity. These difficulties contributed to the P-38's mixed reputation in the European theater. Some pilots valued its range, firepower, and twin-engine security. Others found it less satisfactory than expected under European conditions. The later P-51 Mustang became the dominant American long-range escort in that theater. The Lightning continued to perform valuable work, especially in reconnaissance and specialized missions. But its greatest fame would come elsewhere. The Pacific gave the P-38 a battlefield suited to many of its strongest qualities. Distances were enormous. Airfields were often separated by hundreds of miles of ocean, jungle, and mountains. Weather could change quickly. Navigation errors could be fatal. A pilot forced down far from land might disappear without witnesses. Long range was therefore not a secondary advantage. It was central to operations. The P-38 could carry substantial internal fuel and external drop tanks. Its two engines gave it the endurance and speed required for long missions. Its concentrated nose guns were effective against aircraft, ships, vehicles, and ground positions. The wide landing gear and large airframe brought their own challenges on primitive fields. But the Lightning could perform missions that many shorter-ranged fighters could not. Its twin engines also mattered psychologically. A P-38 could not always return safely after losing one engine. Altitude, weight, damage, pilot technique, and the condition of the remaining engine all mattered. At low speed or during takeoff, asymmetric power could become extremely dangerous. Nevertheless, there were many cases in which a damaged Lightning returned on one engine across distances that would have been impossible for a single-engine fighter. For pilots flying over open water, That possibility carried enormous value. When the P-38 entered combat in the Southwest Pacific, it faced Japanese aircraft and pilots with formidable strengths. The Mitsubishi A6M0, operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy, had exceptional range and low-speed maneuverability. In the early war, it was often flown by highly trained naval aviators with combat experience in China and elsewhere. The Zero achieved its performance through careful attention to weight. Early versions carried little armor protection for the pilot and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. These choices improved range and agility, but increased vulnerability when the aircraft was hit. That did not make the Zero a fragile toy. It was a dangerous, well-designed fighter used with great skill. But a concentrated burst from the P-38's nose guns could inflict severe damage if the American pilot obtained a firing position. The problem was obtaining that position without surrendering the Lightning's advantages. The P-38 could turn, and at some speeds it could maneuver better than its size suggested. Its fowler flaps could be partially deployed in combat to increase lift and tighten a turn. Skilled pilots learned to use the aircraft effectively in both horizontal and vertical maneuvers. Yet it was still unwise to enter a prolonged, slow, level-turning contest with a Zero. The Zero was lighter and could usually turn more tightly at low speed. A P-38 pilot who continued to pull around after it could lose airspeed, increase his angle of attack, and become vulnerable. The Lightning's weight and inertia made energy management essential. It was not enough to point the nose toward the enemy. The pilot had to preserve the speed and altitude that allowed him to control the terms of the engagement. This principle was not unique to the P-38. American pilots in several aircraft learned that Japanese fighters should not be fought according to the enemy's strongest qualities. The best response was often to use speed, altitude, teamwork, and disciplined attacks. For the Lightning, that meant beginning from an advantageous position whenever possible. A flight could patrol above the expected combat area, using altitude as stored energy. When an opportunity appeared, the P-38s could dive, attack with their concentrated guns, and then climb away, rather than remaining in a turning fight. This method is often described as boom and zoom. The phrase can make it sound simple. In reality, it required judgment and cooperation. The attacking pilot had to identify the target, watch for other enemy aircraft, estimate closure speed, fire at the correct moment, and avoid overshooting into danger. His wingman had to protect him. After the attack, the formation had to regain altitude without becoming separated. A pilot who missed could not allow frustration to dictate the next move. Turning back immediately after a nimble enemy might place the Lightning at a disadvantage. Discipline meant accepting that one attack had failed, extending away, rebuilding speed and altitude, and preparing another attack. The rule, never turn with a Zero, was useful because it was memorable, especially for inexperienced pilots. But taken literally, it oversimplifies combat. Pilots sometimes had to turn. They sometimes fought at low altitude. They sometimes survived close maneuvering engagements. The deeper rule was to avoid remaining slow and predictable in the Zero's preferred kind of fight. Combat experience taught this lesson more effectively than any classroom. New pilots arrived with limited knowledge of the theater. Veterans explained which maneuvers preserved energy how Japanese formations behaved when a Zero could reverse direction, and how quickly an apparently safe attack could become dangerous. The P-38's nose armament rewarded patience. Unlike wing guns set to converge at a chosen distance, the Lightning's guns fired nearly parallel. This made the weapon system effective over a broader range, but it did not make accurate shooting automatic. Deflection, range estimation, vibration, target movement, and pilot skill still mattered. When a Lightning pilot fired from close range, the result could be devastating. 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated their fire into a narrow area. Against Japanese fighters, lacking heavy protection, a brief, accurate burst could be enough. Against bombers or ground targets, the cannon added destructive power. The aircraft's range and firepower led to one of the most famous interception missions of the war. In April 1943, American intelligence learned that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet, would fly to an inspection area in the northern Solomon Islands. P-38s were selected because few other Allied fighters could make the long overwater flight, conduct the interception, and return. The mission demanded precise navigation and strict radio silence. The Lightnings flew at low altitude to reduce the chance of detection, then climbed near the interception point. On April 18, they attacked Yamamoto's formation near Bougainville. His aircraft was shot down, and he was killed. The operation did not prove that the P-38 was superior in every form of air combat. It demonstrated something more important. The aircraft could combine range, speed, firepower, and planning to reach an enemy at a place he believed was secure. The mission represented the kind of war the Lightning was built to fight. As combat continued, Lockheed and the Army Air Forces improved the aircraft. The P-38 passed through many versions, and no single model should be treated as representative of every Lightning flown during the war. Engine installations changed. Cooling systems were revised. Fuel capacity and cockpit equipment improved. The later P-38J introduced distinctive enlarged radiator housings beneath the engine nacelles, often called chin radiators. These changes improved cooling and helped resolve some earlier operating problems. Later P-38J production also introduced hydraulically boosted ailerons. This was a major improvement, but its effect must be described accurately. Ailerons control roll, the rotation of the aircraft around its longitudinal axis. At high speed, aerodynamic loads on conventional controls could become extremely heavy. The hydraulic boost reduced the pilot's physical effort and allowed the Lightning to roll more rapidly and responsively, particularly at higher speeds. The system did not transform the P-38 into a lightweight fighter or guarantee that it could outturn a Zero. Turn performance and roll performance are related in combat, but are not the same. A fighter must roll to establish bank, but maintaining a tight turn also depends on lift, weight, speed, drag, power, and the risk of stall. Partial flap settings help the P-38 generate more lift in combat. Pilots used the maneuvering setting when appropriate, but the flaps also produced drag. They were not a free increase in performance. A pilot who used them without regard to speed and energy could still place himself in danger. There are stories that P-38 power settings on the two engines to pivot through unusually tight turns. Teexpt through asymmetric thrust can produce yaw, and skilled pilots understood the effects of separate throttles. But dramatic claims that the Lightning routinely turned around one wing by pulling back one engine and advancing the other should be treated cautiously. Near stall speed, strong asymmetric power could be hazardous. The proven advantages of the P-38 came from disciplined energy management, not from a secret maneuver that overturned the laws of flight. By 1944, late-model Lightnings were better aircraft than the early machines that had entered combat. Dive recovery flaps gave pilots a more reliable means of escaping dangerous high-speed dives. Boosted ailerons improved roll control. Cooling, heating, and engine systems had been refined. The P-38L, the most numerous version, could exceed 400 miles per hour and carry bombs, rockets, or drop tanks, in addition to its internal guns. Yet improvements in the aircraft were only part of the story. The balance of air power in the Pacific had also changed. Japan began the war with a limited body of highly trained naval and army aviators. Their training had been demanding, and many possessed extensive experience. But Japan's system could not replace losses quickly enough. Battles over New Guinea, the Solomons, the Central Pacific, and the Philippines consumed veteran pilots at a rate the training organization could not sustain. American forces, by contrast, expanded their training system, production capacity, maintenance organizations, radar networks, intelligence services, and logistical support. By the later years of the war, many Japanese pilots entered combat with far less preparation than the veterans of 1941 and 1942. Therefore, the P-38's growing success cannot be explained by one modification. Later Lightnings were more capable. American tactics were more mature. Pilots had more accumulated experience. Ground crews understood the aircraft better. Intelligence and command systems improved. At the same time, the average experience of the opposing force declined. These factors worked together. No pilot better represented the combat success of the P-38 than Richard Ira Bong. Bong came from Wisconsin and learned to fly before entering the Army Air Corps. He did not fit the popular image of the aggressive, theatrical fighter ace. He was often described as quiet and modest. Yet in combat he possessed exceptional situational awareness, determination, and the ability to bring the P-38 close enough for a decisive shot. Bong himself acknowledged that his gunnery was not based on extraordinary long-range marksmanship. He preferred to reduce uncertainty by closing the distances. That method was dangerous. At close range, the target could maneuver suddenly. Debris could strike the attacking aircraft, and there was little time to avoid a collision. But the P-38's concentrated guns were especially effective when fired from close range. Bong repeatedly placed himself where a short burst could not easily miss. He scored his first victories in late 1942 and continued adding to his total through successive tours. His growing score attracted attention from commanders, journalists, and the American public. In April 1944, his 26th and 27th victories carried him beyond the American record associated with Eddie Rickenbacker from the First World War. Bong eventually returned to the Pacific and raised his official total to 40. All 40 victories were achieved while flying P-38s. The number alone does not explain his value. Bong also served as an instructor and helped less experienced pilots understand combat. He survived not because the P-38 made him invulnerable, but because he combined aggression with awareness, and because he generally understood when to continue an attack and when to leave. After reaching 40 victories, Bong was removed from combat. The decision reflected both his national importance and the desire to preserve an experienced pilot whose knowledge could be used elsewhere. He returned to the United States as the highest-scoring American ace of the war. His story later ended tragically. On August 6, 1945, while working as a test pilot, Bong was killed in the crash of a P-80 jet fighter in California. His death occurred on the same day that the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and the enormous news of that event overshadowed reports of the accident. He was 24 years old. The second highest scoring American ace was Thomas Buchanan Maguire Jr. Maguire was different from Bong in personality. He could be intense, demanding, and fiercely competitive. He studied the P-38 closely and became one of its most skilled pilots. He understood its systems, its limits, and the tactical importance of preserving speed. He also had a strong desire to increase his victory total. By the end of 1944, Maguire had 38 confirmed aerial victories, only 2 fewer than Bong. He had received the Medal of Honor for Extraordinary Actions on December 20 and 26, 1944, when he fought repeated engagements and destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft over 2 days. Maguire's ambition has sometimes led storytellers to describe his final mission as a reckless hunt for the record. Competition almost certainly mattered to him, but reducing the mission to personal vanity is unfair. Fighter units were still conducting combat operations. Japanese aircraft remained dangerous. Maguire was an experienced leader, responsible for the men flying with him. On January 7, 1945, Maguire led 4 P-38Ls over Negros Island in the Philippines. The flight was operating at low altitude when it encountered a Japanese Army fighter. The enemy aircraft was not a Mitsubishi Zero. It was a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, known to the Allies as the Oscar. The Ki-43, like the Zero, was light and highly maneuverable. It generally lacked the heavy protection found in later American fighters. But in the hands of an experienced pilot, it remained extremely dangerous in a low-speed turning fight. Sput Tupple, the Japanese pilot involved in the engagement, is commonly identified as Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto. The precise sequence of the battle has been reconstructed from American accounts and later research, but not every second can be known with certainty. Maguire's formation was flying with external fuel tanks. Normally, pilots would drop tanks before entering combat because they added weight and drag. On this mission, the tanks remained attached, apparently, because the flight still needed fuel for its planned operations and return. During the fight, the Ki-43 threatened one of Maguire's companions. Maguire attempted a hard, low-altitude maneuver to intervene. His official Medal of Honor-related history emphasizes that he risked an extremely hazardous maneuver in an effort to save another pilot. At only a few hundred feet above the ground, there was almost no margin for error. The P-38 was slow, banked steeply, and burdened by its external tanks. Under those conditions, A stall could become unrecoverable before the pilot had time or altitude to respond. The Lightning stalled and rolled. Maguire's aircraft struck the ground and was destroyed. He was 24 years old. It is tempting to turn the accident into a simple moral lesson. The master broke his own rule, and the airplane punished him. Reality was less tidy. Maguire was not performing a careless demonstration. He was engaged in combat at low altitude, trying to respond to an immediate threat to another aircraft. The drop tanks, low speed, steep bank, and lack of altitude all contributed to an extremely dangerous situation. No single sentence can reproduce every force acting on the P-38 in those final seconds. What can be said is that engineering improvements could not remove the basic laws of flight. Boosted ailerons could make the aircraft roll more effectively. Maneuver flaps could increase lift. Powerful engines could accelerate the fighter. None of these systems could guarantee recovery from a stall only a few hundred feet above the ground. Maguire's remains were not officially recovered and returned to the United States until 1949. An airbase in New Jersey was later named for him. His 38 victories remain the second highest American total of the war. The deaths of Verdun and Maguire occurred in very different circumstances. Verdun died during a pre-war test program while engineers struggled with high-speed aerodynamics. Maguire died in combat after years of improvements had made the P-38 a far more mature aircraft. They should not be presented as victims of exactly the same defect. Verdun's story belongs primarily to compressibility, experimental controls, and structural loads. Maguire's belongs to low-altitude maneuvering, energy loss, stall, external stores, and the uncertainty of combat. Yet the two events reveal a common truth. An aircraft can be technologically advanced and still remain subject to strict limits. Speed, power, and improved controls increase a pilot's choices, but they do not cancel physics. The P-38 became successful because engineers and pilots learned those limits, not because they made the limits disappear. This is why the popular idea of a single miraculous modification is so misleading. There was no lone mechanic who transformed the Lightning in one afternoon. There was no secret wire, hidden lever, or throttle trick that suddenly allowed every P-38 to circle inside a zero. The aircraft developed through an accumulation of work. Designers refined cooling and engine installations. NACA researchers studied compressibility and pitching moments. Test pilots entered dangerous regimes to collect information. Production workers incorporated changes into new blocks of aircraft. Mechanics in combat theaters learned how to keep complicated engines, turbo superchargers, intercoolers, hydraulic systems, and guns operating under difficult conditions. Instructors converted losses into warnings that could be passed to new pilots. Combat pilots added another kind of knowledge. They learned how far a formation could travel on a given fuel load. They learned the best climb settings, the safest ways to manage engines, and the signs of trouble. They learned which enemy aircraft could be outrun, which could outturn them, and when an apparent advantage was actually a trap. The Lightning became effective because all of these forms of knowledge met in one machine. Its strengths were substantial. It was fast at altitude. It had excellent range for a fighter of its period. Its nose guns were powerful and accurate. It could carry bombs and rockets. It could photograph enemy territory at high speed in unarmed reconnaissance versions. It could escort bombers, attack airfields, intercept transports, and conduct long-range fighter sweeps. Its weaknesses were also real. It was expensive and complicated. It demanded careful maintenance. Early models had serious high-speed control problems and inadequate cockpit heating. Engine difficulties damaged its reputation in Europe. At low speed, it could not safely imitate the turning style of much lighter Japanese fighters. Losing one engine did not always mean that the second engine could save the pilot. A serious history must hold both sides together. The P-38 was neither a failure rescued by one clever trick nor a perfect masterpiece unfairly criticized by inexperienced pilots. It was an ambitious aircraft developed under wartime pressure. Some of its most important qualities were present from the beginning. Others required years of correction. Its success depended on where it fought, how it was maintained, and whether pilots used its advantages intelligently. In the Pacific, those advantages often aligned with operational need. The long distances favored range. The lack of nearby emergency fields increased the value of two engines. Japanese aircraft were vulnerable to concentrated fire. The lightning speed allowed pilots to attack and disengage when they maintained energy. The P-38 Lightning remains one of the most recognizable aircraft ever built. Its central cockpit, twin booms, and paired engines give it a form that seems almost futuristic even decades later. That appearance has encouraged legends. Some make the aircraft sound invincible. Others reduce its history to defects and accidents. The truth is more demanding and more valuable. The Lightning was an advanced design that entered service before every part of its behavior was understood. It suffered dangerous compressibility effects in high-speed dives. Early versions exposed pilots to cold, mechanical difficulties, and heavy controls. It could not safely surrender speed in prolonged low-altitude turning contests with lighter Japanese fighters. It was also fast, heavily armed, long-ranged, adaptable, and capable of surviving damage under circumstances that would have destroyed many single-engine aircraft. Later versions corrected its important deficiencies. In the hands of trained pilots using disciplined tactics, it became a formidable combat aircraft. There was no miracle. There was research. There was manufacturing. There was training. There was maintenance. There was accumulated experience, preserved in reports, and passed from veteran to replacement. And there were losses. On November 4, 1941, Ralph Verdun died before America entered the war. His aircraft fell on a peaceful California neighborhood because the P-38 program had reached a dangerous frontier of high-speed flight. On January 7, 1945, Thomas Maguire died over Negroes after the Lightning had become a proven weapon. He was not defeated by the same aerodynamic phenomenon that haunted Verdun. He was lost in the unforgiving combination of low altitude, low speed, steep maneuvering, external stores, and combat uncertainty. Between those deaths lay the development of an aircraft and the education of an air force. That education cannot be reduced to a wire, a flap, or a clever sentence. It was built through thousands of decisions. An engineer choosing a new installation, a researcher interpreting pressure data, a mechanic tightening a line, an instructor warning a new pilot, a flight leader deciding whether to attack, a wingman remaining in position when instinct urged him to chase. That is the real story of the P-38 Lightning. It is not the story of a clumsy fighter suddenly taught to dance by one secret trick. It is the story of a difficult, powerful aircraft gradually brought to maturity by science, labor, combat experience, and sacrifice. It is the story of men who flew near the limits of what their generation understood. And it is the story of those who did not return, whose losses became warnings, data, procedures, and memories carried forward by others. The Lightning earned its place in history not because it conquered every weakness, but because people learned its strengths, respected its limits, and used it to accomplish missions few other fighters could perform. The aircraft was aluminum, engines, fuel, guns, and wire. The achievement